the Traveler's original blade. This sword's current whereabouts are enshrouded in mystery, causing some to ask the question: if both Travelers were sealed by the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, why is it that our Traveler lost their sword and our Sibling still retains their own? Well, the answer to that question is actually quite a bit simpler than most realize, but the explanation is easy to overlook. In this video, I'm going to show the rather simple reason our Traveler lost their sword and discuss whether we might see it again in the future. But first, I'm currently striving to reach the goal of 150,000 subscribers. So, whether you're new to the channel or you've watched lots of my videos but haven't subscribed yet, please support what I do by subscribing and help me beat the YouTube algorithm and reach my goal of 150,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. A somewhat common topic of conversation regarding Genshin Impact's Travelers, whether it be a legitimate discussion, joke, meme, or anything else, is the Traveler's use of the dull blade. When at the start of the game, the Traveler summons this weapon, only for it to never appear again over the past 2 years. We're never really offered an explanation as to where it went, or why it was missing after our Traveler awakens following their encounter with the Sustainer. For a time, this was accepted as just a non-canon substitution, so as not to interfere with continuity, as our own playable Traveler would not be wielding this weapon when used actively by the player. But this never really sat right with many, including myself, as the weapon the Traveler wields in cutscenes continues not to reflect the weapon that you as a player equip either, meaning the concept of equipped weapon continuity is somewhat out of the window. The real-world logistics of game development and story delivery then often enter the conversation, with the assumption being that since action and battle sequences are pre-rendered, a less distinctive replacement sword would need to be utilized in order to minimize distraction and questions over why the Traveler never uses their original blade. Again, like with other arguments, this too is often a point of contention. Because those scenes are pre-rendered, why then change the sword in the first place? Particularly when the Traveler often channels energy through the dull sword, giving a good opportunity for an open-ended return of the Outlander's original blade. With no conclusive statements or plot developments to lend to the sword's seemingly meaningless removal following the opening scene of the game, the conversation stopped for a while. Then, in version 1.4, we were treated to our first and only true face-to-face encounter with our Sibling thus far, a scene which opened with this. After this, it no longer seemed that the real-world pre-rendering explanation for the Traveler's missing sword was adequate enough to explain the missing Outlander's blade. Lumine still has hers, and certainly that detail would be too important to overlook for most players invested in the story. So, if Hoyoverse never had intention of ensuring visual continuity on screen with our character's actual equipped weapon, then that means that the choice to relieve them of their original Outlander's blade was done intentionally. The weapon's exclusion, whether you're actively aware of it or not, creates a visual distinction between Aether and Lumine, making it seem as if she still has access to a power that Aether doesn't. And if that wasn't the intent, why bother to change it at all? For the longest time, that's where this entire discussion stopped for me, until some time ago a user on Twitter dropped an eagle-eyed catch on me that changed everything about how I considered this weapon's disappearance. In the opening moments of Genshin Impact, many of the game's mysteries are established, including the arrival and disappearance of the unknown god, the sealing and separation of our siblings by an apparent minimum of 500 years, and the use and loss of our Traveler's original blade. With so much going on in the scene, it's easy to overlook the one simple detail that explains why our Traveler today wields the dull blade. But rather than explain it, let me show you. There. Did you see it? It's a blink and you'll miss it moment. But once it's been pointed out to you, you'll never unsee it. After the Sustainer telegraphs her absorption attack, by looking at Aether, he simply releases his hands from the hilt of his blade, abandoning it to the Sustainer's power. If you look closely at the wide shot afterwards, you can see what appears to be the hilt of the blade protruding from the Sustainer's attack. The blade is then presumably absorbed along with his sister and has not been seen since. You might be further excused for not realizing this occurred, as our traveler immediately lunges out with an impressive power attack resembling the length and color of the Outlander's blade. But it was on closer inspection an attack emanating from the traveler's hand and arm, rather than his now stolen blade. This also explains rather intuitively, after the sustainer rewinds the explosive effect of the attack, why the traveler's weaponless hand was left bound, as it was never his blade which was the driving force behind that attack. After this, it's history as usual. Our traveler was absorbed, leaving each of the twins to their own separate journeys. This realization then begs the question, if the sword was absorbed along with Lumine, what happened to it afterwards? For me, the question conjures up a powerful scene of Lumine immediately following her disappearance, lying on the ground unconscious amongst the still fresh destruction of Conria. The muffled and distant sounds of crumbling structures seem to be drawing nearer, until at last she is awoken by the cataclysmic sounds. Her head slowly clears as she begins to regain clarity on what happened. Realizing where she is, she quickly gets to her feet, having no idea how much time has passed. Looking around, she hopes to find that her brother has also somehow, miraculously avoided harm, but he's nowhere to be seen. And then, her heart sinks as she locks her eyes on it. Aether's sword, lying nearby. Devastated and fearing the worst, she collects the blade, dwelling for a moment on the choices that led to this. Asking herself if it's all her fault. She wonders, if she had just left him sleeping in that meteor, might he have remained safe? Then the thought occurs, that he may too appear here just as she has. But the destruction is closing in around her. Frantically, she weighs her options. The safe route of escape is quickly diminishing, and she knows she can't stay there. She forces herself, despite an overwhelming desire to stay, to run, and hope that his fate is not the same as hers. Escaping the perils of the abyssal moonspire, back to the surface of Teyvat. Her brother is gone. Donning masks, Conria's people are transformed into shameful shadows of their former selves. Lumine takes her leave of death and devastation, keeping her brother's blade safe in her possession as an added reminder of why she must fight against the thrones of Celestia, not knowing whether she would ever see him again. If this is remotely close to the events that Lumine experienced after encountering the Sustainer, it is likely that Lumine still has Aether's blade, or perhaps she has laid it to rest somewhere after an unknown period of time as a memorial to her dear brother. And there it still lies, waiting for Aether to retrieve it. Or perhaps whatever power, if any, lies within the blade of our traveler was used to manifest a greater power within Lumine herself. It's possible that that may even be tied to why Aether lost his power, and Lumine appears to still retain her own, as the white light the two displayed in the game's opening scene still shines brightly upon her own garbs. For now, nothing is certain except that the sword was subtly taken out of play, intentionally, and it is likely that our traveler will cross paths with their lost blade once again, and possibly with it, a portion of their lost power would return as well. That quick reaction of our traveler to abandon his blade has so much potential attached to it. Perhaps, if the traveler hadn't been so quick, the two siblings would have both been banished to the abyssal moonspire together, changing the entire history of Teyvat in the process. But maybe that was the point. Maybe our traveler's quick reaction was the 1 in a million shot that gave a higher power a path to end Teyvat's never-ending cycle of death and rebirth. And potentially that is what caught the Sustainer off guard in her moment of triumph against the siblings. That's it for this.